And that was the story. She had the whip. Now, of course, predictably, news of this menage came home to the Nietzsche family, and they sent Elizabeth to investigate. And so Elizabeth arrived on the scene, outraged with the immorality that was going on. Little did she know there was no immorality whatsoever. It was 10-hour philosophical walks. Not body fluid had been exchanged, not even a passionate kiss. But she arrived on the presumption that there was an immoral menage a trois going on involving her saintly brother. She was just enraged, and she confronted Lou, and Lou was very diplomatic about it all and tried to be a nice woman about it all and tried to tell her there's nothing immoral here. Elizabeth didn't believe them 1 minute. Who could believe that story? And so the outcome was that Nietzsche was enraged at his sister showing up. And so, of course, a very cold water was put on the whole thing. He was mad at her. He was mad. Then they all went to Leipzig, and they had some arguments because, of course, Salome was getting a little tired of his proposals, and she knew that he was madly in love with her. And then one day, Lou and Paul just ditched Nietzsche. So I guess she was finally sick of it, and poor Nietzsche came home. They were gone. And, of course, he wrote letters right away saying, well, we shall see one another from time to time, won't we? But the answer was no, they were not going to see each other. They were both sick of it, and off they went. We can understand this perfectly well. I mean, if you go traveling around Europe for months and months and months, you're a threesome, and nobody's getting any action that you know about, obviously the time is going to come for you to part. You're going to go all off with what you were doing. But he's madly in love with her, so he's still writing letters, hoping that there's going to be a reunion someplace that he'll get to see her. Never saw her again. That was it. Over. And he was devastated. Totally, totally devastated. And most of all, furious at his sister. Most of all, enraged and furious at his sister. Blamed her for the whole thing, thought she did it. Of course, it wasn't true. She was just a little part of the problem. And he now went back to Italy, weakened and saddened and upset, and now comes the most productive few years of his life and also the most important book. He's going to write it in Italy, so he'll be living in various Italian locations. There's the map. As you can see, it's just down the coast from Genova and pretty close to the Florentine coast, which is down at the bottom of the map. So pretty easy to get to. Beautiful coastal town along with Portofino. And now begins these last 6 very productive years, 82 to 88. He's almost totally alone. This is a sort of shocking change from what his life has just been for the last year, because in the last year he's been with these other 2 people all the time. He sometimes needs to ask a friend to take dictation so he can dictate the books he's working on. But most of the time he's staying in cheap hotels or rented rooms, nothing fancy ever, not with many possessions, not with all his books by any means, and still is able to sit down and write. Now, in order to get through the terrible migraines, he's using huge doses of opium. And so he's making himself sick. And he's writing prescriptions for various medications and making himself sick with those too. He's slowly destroying his health. And in this period is when he writes, "Thus spake Zarathustra." Now, this book is coming at this last period of the 19th century as I described it to you. So this is the moment when other Europeans are either fleeing Europe because they're looking for something else like Gauguin, or they're under a sense of collapse like Toulouse-Lautrec. And there will be books, multiple books coming out in 1890, 91, 2, 3, 4, 5, that will be talking about things like degeneration and decline. One of these books is called Degeneration. The author is a Hungarian doctor, Max Nordau, and his book is a huge, huge success. It's translated in all languages, and it circulates all over Europe immediately in exactly this decade that we're talking about. And what is he going to say? Well, he just says that all of Europe is sick, that it has a contempt for traditional values and traditional ideas, i.e. Christianity. He sees it a kind of decadence, world weariness, rejection of moral values. That was exactly what he was seeing. That was absolutely correct. He thinks it's a kind of medical condition, that Europe is sick, and he was, of course, right. To a degree it was. Spengler is going to publish the sort of definitive summary book into the next century, The Decline of the West. All the same themes, all the same summaries, that circa 1900, Europe is sick. The Decline of the West is a key book. Now, in the middle of this exact moment, when the end of the century writing and thinking is appearing, and when other writers are also commenting on these exact things, the whole of the 90s, the 1890s, it's called fin de siècle, the end of the century. It's a phrase now that circulates everywhere, and it's all talking about the last decade of the 19th century. In other words, the specific phenomenon of the end of the 19th century is fin de siècle, and you can see it in Paris, you can see it in Vienna, you can see it in London, and you can name artists and writers in every single one of those capitals that gives the voice to exactly this thing. And now, into this all comes Nietzsche's book, Thus Spake Zarathustra. Now, right away you say, what's the title? What's this all about? He's creating a fiction. He's creating a kind of poetic religious fiction. And he's inventing this prophet, Zarathustra. It's a play on the figure in ancient Persian religion, Zoroaster. So you've heard about Zoroaster as an ancient Persian religion way before Islam, into say 1000 BC. So he's using that to give him this arresting title, Thus Spake Zarathustra, so that he can then put in front of Europe, in this, what will be the last decade, these prophecies. And so the poem is like a biblical book. And the prophet Zarathustra comes down from the mountaintop, the wilderness, and at 30 begins to preach to the people. So it's also a play on Jesus. The prologue sets up the themes. Zarathustra comes down, he's a hermit, he's off living, and then he comes back, and now he begins to preach to the people. He descends from the mountain, he encounters a saint, and in this dialogue he has with the saint, he says, well, that saint has not heard yet that God is dead. So there's the key phrase in the book that comes out of the voice of Zarathustra, within which will be then shared the other revelations that are in the book. And so Zarathustra comes down from the mountain, meets the hermit. Zarathustra is alone. He spake in his heart, can it actually be possible that an old saint has not heard that God is dead? But of course, God is dead. All gods are dead. All the old gods have come to an end long ago. So here is Nietzsche at the end of the 19th century, having come out of this religious origin, gone through the crisis, his personal crisis, and now he sums it all up in this book. He writes at a white-hot speed. He's turning this out, dictating some of it in an extraordinary burst. And now his soul rose, it overflowed, a new teacher appears, Zarathustra, and this Zarathustra will now talk about a new religion, a new man, and he will sing a song about this new man. Nietzsche knows that this is his masterpiece, and he's right, it is. This work stands alone, he wrote to a friend, do not let it mention the poets in the same breath. It was hard to get it printed. Most of his friends had, by this point, peeled away because he was becoming more and more known, the atheist, and that meant in many places that wasn't acceptable, many universities. So he was losing a lot of friends, and it was very hard for him to get it published, and he isn't going to make any money from its publication. But as the years go by, it will become more and more famous, and then after he's gone, his sister and copyrights she has will gain to her. Now, out of the prophecy of Zarathustra comes the future vision, and the idea is that no longer do we waste time on the ridiculous Christian effort of loving your neighbor, but instead, what we need is the development of a finer and stronger individual. So we shouldn't be turning our attention to mankind. Mankind doesn't exist. It's an abstraction. But what should be the goal are these new, finer human beings. The very last thing a sensible man would undertake would be to improve mankind. Mankind does not improve. It does not even exist. The aspect of the whole is much more like that of a huge experimental workshop where some things in every age succeed, but most things fail. And so what we need is the improvement of the human type. And therefore, what we should do is be breeding greater human beings. So, for example, how absurd it is to let higher individuals marry for love, you see? So here you get eugenics. Here you get the idea that what you want to do is breed a finer, higher, taller, handsomer, broader-shouldered beauty. Love, he's rejecting Schopenhauer, that even Schopenhauer's wrong. Schopenhauer thought there was an inherent drive that would drive us to reproduce, but no, man should not be permitted to just make decisions that affect his entire life. He should be marrying for improvement of the race. The best should marry only the best. Love should not be left to the rabble. The purpose of marriage is not reproduction. It should be development and improvement of the race. So what we want to do is create a new Superman. Democracy is not part of this, because democracy is just a mania for counting noses. Democracy is no good. It should be gotten rid of. The first step here is the destruction of Christianity. So far as all higher men are concerned, the triumph of Christ is the beginning of democracy. The first Christians were, in the deepest instincts, rebels against everything privileged. They lived and struggled for equal rights. Don't listen to any of that. What we want you to do is join this effort to create the finer human being. Democracy means drift. It means permission given to each part of an organism to do just what it pleases. Worship of mediocrity, hatred of excellence. It means the impossibility of great men. What chance would they have? What is hated by the people, a wolf by the dogs, is a free spirit. So in other words, he's proposing, the prophet, he's proposing a new and better human being. The Ubermensch, the Superman. Now, everyone here knows that idea is going to be taken in the 1930s and embraced by Hitler. And he will therefore embrace Nietzsche's sister, who survives into the 1930s. And in fact, she will become a celebrity in the circles of Hitler, of course, because this book sounds exactly like what fascists would have wanted. And then he goes further in his book, Beyond Good and Evil. He's elaborating his ideas and thereby suggests that in this new age that he's prophesying, these human beings, these supermen, can get beyond the separation of just good and evil and live in this new world, this world where things are planned in the new age that would go beyond good and evil. These books were coming out, month after month after month. He was living at a terrible increased pace. He was sick. He was taking his drugs. And so he's slowly breaking down. So the production of the book, both Zarathustra and Beyond Good and Evil, suggest a kind of slow breakdown. And the one figure who resembles him the most is the hero in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, because in exactly the same way as Nietzsche is recommending in his book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, so too Raskolnikov is embracing the same idea that we can live beyond good and evil, and that he was going to prove that in his own life by committing a murder and being able to survive. And by doing so, he would show that someone could live above good and evil. And in the book, he breaks down under the pressure. And therefore, the story of the living, real person Nietzsche is prefigured. Crime and Punishment already existed when Nietzsche is living his life, and he's read it, so he knows that story. And the ideas are in Crime and Punishment, the very ideas that he's going to profess. They're right inside the mouths of the characters in Crime and Punishment. Yet he proceeds with his book and his publications. And if we turn to Crime and Punishment and Dostoevsky, we can see that the author of Crime and Punishment correctly evaluates the ability of the ordinary human being to live like this and to arrogate to ourselves the power to live above good and evil. And so that's the fascinating thing about it. For Nietzsche, the driving force of the university is the will to power. The will to power describes what he believed to be the main driving force in humans: achievement, ambition, striving to reach the highest possible position in life. If you ask, what did Paul believe? Turn to Corinthians, and you can read chapter 13, and it's about love. So there's the opposition, and he knows all this. Nietzsche knows all this very well. If you read Thus Spake Zarathustra, he has a very clear evaluation of what he thinks about Christianity. And under the onslaught, he's breaking down. He's breaking down in this lonely life, and the breakdown comes about in Torino, the north of Italy. He's staying in Turin. He's all alone, renting a room. And here's the map showing where Torino is, northern Italy, sort of on a line with Milan, the most northwestern city in Italy. And in January 1889, he has a mental breakdown. And the incident, that's a picture of the piazza where it all took place. And the story is an amazing one, that Nietzsche is here in the Piazza San Carlo, and he sees a horse being flogged by his owner, and he runs to the man and throws his arms around the neck to protect it, to stop it from being beaten, and then falls to the ground. It just shows that in that moment, his good heart, it just overcomes this horror that he's watching. He can't stand to see this, and so he throws himself into the middle of it. Of course, the police are called, and he is taken home to his room, and then friends are called, his family's called. The closest friend was in Switzerland, so the friend came from Switzerland and took him back to Basel, and he's put into a temporary hospital, and then later his sister will come and take him home to Germany. So the friend came to Turin, and then later his mother came, moved him to a clinic at her home, and then later his sister returned. She'd been living in South America. She returned and moved him to Weimar, where they had good care, and bought a house, and now she took care of him for the rest of his life. So basically for the next 10 years, from 1890 to 1900, he's in the care of his sister. His mother passed away in 1897, but his sister Elizabeth will live on to the days of Hitler and become a huge star in the 30s within the Nazi circles, because they, of course, loved Thus Spake Zarathustra. In fact, the Germans liked it so much, the German army authorities had given a copy of Thus Spake Zarathustra to every soldier in World War I. So people loved it. Of course, Elizabeth now went to work on the archives, and Nietzsche experts feel that she, misedited some of it, and maybe hid some of the things she didn't like. That's probably the case. But now we're more than 100 years away, and Nietzsche's scholarship is massive. People are writing books about him all the time. So I think at this point we have a pretty good idea. Here's the last photograph of him. I love the photograph because he's leaning on Elizabeth. That's her right next to him. He contracted pneumonia in August, and then he had a stroke on the 24th of August and died on the 25th. They took him home to their original town, and he's buried next to his mother and father. She went on to have quite a career. As you can see, here's a biography of her, Nietzsche's sister. She lived to 1935, and so her power over the surviving books and documents was very great, and there's no question that she made sure that they were edited the way she wanted to. And that included Nietzsche visiting Hitler visiting the Nietzsche Museum that we saw earlier. And he gave Mussolini a beautiful gold embossed collection of the writings of Nietzsche to Mussolini. There he is, shaking Mussolini's hand and happy to give him a copy. As we look back at this whole story here tonight, I think we have to see him as a kind of tragic genius, not malevolent, but gifted with a spectacular intellect, genius ability to recall what he'd read. He read massively and could sit down and then write. But someone who lived through the whole century untethered and unconnected to community, even in the last years unconnected to any kind of family. And I think it was too much for him. It's true that he had these illnesses from the very early years, but still, the way he lived in the last 8 years or so was almost self-destructive. And I think it was the burden of these thoughts coming at the end of the 19th century. I think they were overwhelming, just as they overwhelmed Raskolnikov. So as we think back to him, I don't think we should think of him as in any way evil, but as a brilliant person who grappled with all the major themes of the 19th century and was wrong about some of them.